Hello, I'm Alan Walker, host of the Twin Cities Creation Science Association podcast. I am on the board of the Twin Cities Creation Science Association. I want to thank you, Dr. Ross Olson, for setting up this podcast, and for Brian Lauer for editing and posting on YouTube, and Neil Smith for posting on Rumble. Donny, Budinsky, and Matt Nailor are guests tonight, and they presented recently for the Twin Cities Creation Science Association on June 17th, 2025, on the topic of Did Adam and Eve Exist? Now, listeners, you can go to YouTube and Rumble at our TCCSA site and watch that excellent presentation. Donny and Matt have a creation apologetics ministry called Standing for Truth Ministries that defends the truth of biblical creation and proclaims the gospel of Jesus Christ. Both of you, I really appreciate your energy that you show on your podcasts and the knowledge that you have. And I really know that you must read a lot of scientific papers to keep up on all the subjects that you cover. Now I'd like you both, Donny and Matt, to introduce yourselves in about 1 minute each. Go ahead, Donny.
Alan Walker, I appreciate that introduction and also the feedback regarding our recent talk on the amazing science of Adam and Eve. It is an honor here to be interviewed by you for this podcast. My name is Donny Budinsky. I am married to my beautiful wife, Jessica, and have 3 children. The most important thing about myself, of course, is that I am a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ. I also run the Standing for Truth Ministries, where we exist to uphold the truth of biblical creation. One thing we strongly believe in is critical thinking skills and also engaging in conversations with people of differing viewpoints. And that is why I also host debates and discussions on a variety of topics. That includes creation evolution, which we are largely discussing here today, but also topics regarding theology and eschatology, Bible prophecy, for example. And so we definitely don't shy away from conversations. I've hosted over 450 debates on all sorts of topics at this point. In terms of research, Matt and I are both actively researching topics related to genetics and ancestry, universal or separate ancestry. As creationists, we hold to separate ancestry. And I've also written several books on the topic, including Special Creation. That is a book that specifically focuses on model building and essentially constructing the best possible model for separate ancestry. And I've also written a book called The Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook, which debunks the best so-called evidence for evolution, which is ERVs.
Thank you. And Matt Nailor, you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Matt, and I am Donny Shadow. There we go. I basically help with video editing, and I got into this because I was appalled and shocked at how many people left Christianity because of the evolutionary teaching and millions of years. And then when I found out from a book by Ken Ham called Ready to Return that we found out that 52% of people by the ages of 20 through 29 said that why the Bible contains errors is because of the teaching of evolution. So if that pagan theory has that much of an influence on children and adults alike, then clearly there's a disconnect between what's going on, and our job is to fix that with people. So like Donny said, we write books, make videos on every known topic, and hold debates against critics that think we're wrong. And there it is.
What I like about both of you guys is your age. You're much younger than both Ross and I, so appreciate that and your energy again that you put into your work. Your excellent presentation on the first couple, Adam and Eve, gave a lot of genetic proof of their existence using data collected by different creation scientists like John Sanford, Dr. Rob Carter, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, and Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins. I would like to follow up on the human genetics, especially in the area of the second law of thermodynamics, which requires all things, whether they're organic or inorganic, to move toward disorder and decay. My first question to both of you is Dr. John Sanford, in his historic book, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, shows compelling evidence that the whole human genome has in fact degenerated over time. Many scientific papers have shown that harmful mutations have accumulated, producing a decrease in fitness in human populations. Can you address that? The decay curve, the biological decay curve over time?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Great points. All the men that you mentioned there have been an incredible influence to myself and my growth as a Christian, but also as a biblical creationist, somebody who defends the truth of biblical creation and also works at answering challenges and refuting arguments to young earth creation. Dr. Rob Carter, Dr. John Sanford, his book, Genetic Entropy, has been incredibly influential in my life, especially because I was a working nurse for about 6 years. And I have a lot of real-time experience with death, disease, decay, as you mentioned, the second law of thermodynamics, that everything is winding down. The question for the evolutionist or the atheist is who wound it up? I find it interesting because the first law of thermodynamics states that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. The second law applied to the universe states that everything is winding down, the law of increasing entropy. Okay, well, if we were to wind things back in time to a point of least increasing entropy, but the first law states that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, well, that means matter and energy had to have come into existence from an outside force. And what does the book of Genesis say in the very first verse? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And so there's the answer right there. Now, applied to genetics, the second law, genomes are degenerating due to what's called low impact or nearly neutral, slightly deleterious mutations. Genetic entropy is basically this, that the majority of mutations are nearly neutral. That means natural selection is limited. It can't see most mutations. And therefore, the majority of mutations build up, which is much like how rust builds up on a car over time. Each single rust molecule is inconsequential on its own. It goes unnoticed in many ways. In the same way that a single spelling mistake in a book the size of an encyclopedia, on their own, they're inconsequential. You could still read the book. You could still drive the car with a little bit of rust. But over time, enough spelling mistakes and enough rust, you're going to need a new car. The car will degenerate. The book will become scrambled where it's no longer readable. And in the genomes of living organisms, these deleterious mutations result in genetic sickness in populations over time, and they put shelf lives on genomes. So if species, because of mutation accumulation, Alan, cannot persist for millions of years into the future, that means they could not have persisted for millions of years into the past. And we find extinct biology all throughout the fossil record. And that limits the age of biology. Now, you mentioned a good question with biological decay and the biological decay curve. Well, in a nutshell, because we could discuss this for 2 hours, according to the Bible, Adam lived to 930 years. Biblical patriarchs, they lived hundreds of years. And critics have argued that this is impossible. There's no way somebody could live to 900 or 1,000. It actually turns out, though, that if you plot the ages given in Genesis of the biblical patriarchs, you find a systematic drop-off in lifespans after Noah, who lived 950 years. Now, this could never happen by chance. And this can be correlated to what I was describing here, low impact mutation accumulation. That can be correlated scientifically to increased genetic load. And you can clearly see that the lifespans in Genesis decline according to a well-defined decay curve that began after the great flood of Noah. And it's not an immediate decline like you're jumping off a cliff where it goes from hundreds of years to just boom, right to 80 to 100. No, it is a systematic decline from, you could say, 900 to 600 to 500 to 200 and eventually to what we have today. And so one thing I'll mention, I'll hand it to Matt, and then we can also discuss the three bottlenecks if you'd like to in the creation model. I co-authored an article that refutes critics of genetic entropy with Christopher Roop, and we had the privilege of having that technical article rigorously reviewed by Dr. John Sanford himself. And we showcased that the genetic entropy problem is even worse than once previously thought, because it turns out that the nearly neutral mutation rate, which is fast, approximates what's called the fixation rate, where mutations get stuck in place in populations over time. In technical terms, fixation is basically when a gene has achieved fixation, where its frequency has reached 100% in the population. The problem for evolutionists is this: the majority of mutations are slightly deleterious. So if you have that many mutations in the evolutionary model becoming fixed or stuck in place, that is irreversible and irreparable damage species wide. And now that they're stuck in place, selection can't see them. Selection can't do anything to stop that damage. And so that's a technical article that you can read on our website, stanfordtruthministries.com, and it discusses in detail the genetic entropy thesis. Matt, is there anything you'd like to add to that, brother?
Yeah, I really like the biological decay curve when it comes to the observable evidence that we see with animal inbreeding and pure breeds. There is a drop off that we see from that. And then what happens is we can go over to the Kong et al. Study in 2012 that showed that there's a progression of mutations that get handed down maternally from the father the older he gets. So they extrapolated that, like, well, if Noah himself was 500 and he had kids, how many mutations would be passed on? And it was such a large amount. That's why we see such a drop off in age of his children and his grandchildren until we get to the lower age limits that we see today. And this is in the peer-reviewed literature itself. But we can also go to the wide variety of evidence that's outside of that, because remember, God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what people did. That's why God confused the languages to force mankind to spread out. That's why we see the majority of haplogroups forming in the Middle Eastern area. It's why we see the arrival of new language families all in that area as well, and no new language families ever arising after that. I mean, you can't make this up. It's so good. The evidence is right there. And then we go over to the population growth rates. They match as well. Then we go to the germline mutation rates. Those match as well. It's just the evidence is everywhere, and it's so good.
Well, thank you, Donny and Matt. We could go on a lot, but I'm going to jump to question number two. You mentioned the first 10 generations where they average like over 900 years. And why do you think that's the case? They live so long, both genetically and the environment. Can you touch on those two, genetics and environment, for long life before the flood?
Alan, that is an excellent question, and I will briefly answer it. And then Matt, one of his specialties is biblical longevity. Matt and I, we just recently debated. We participated in a 4.5 hour debate seminar with a prominent apologist of evolution who on YouTube goes by Culture or Conspiracy Cats. And the thesis or resolution was Adam, Eve, and biblical creation. And so a lot of what we're saying here, a lot of these arguments, including these next arguments or points on biblical longevity, for those that want to see how the critics might respond, I would recommend checking out that debate, because Matt and I are very, very happy with it. And to your question, in the pre-flood world, man would have had fewer mutations. The Bible describes three bottlenecks essentially. You've got the bottleneck at creation, where God creates two people, Adam and Eve. Now, we would argue that based on God's command to be fruitful and multiply, that God did not want that to be carried out through cloning. And so he would have designed built-in diversity into Adam and Eve's genomes. In technical terms, this is called created heterozygosity, where Adam, Eve, and this would also apply to the created kinds, they would be in a state of DNA diversity. They'd be front-loaded with a whole a bunch of DNA differences that could be utilized by genetic processes such as recombination, gene conversion to essentially produce novel chromosomal combinations quickly. The DNA differences are built in. We don't need mutations to explain the majority of DNA variety like evolutionists do. Now, the important point there is that Adam and Eve would not have been created with mutations. And so mutations would be introduced after the fall, slowly over time. That means for the majority of the pre-flood world, the populations in the antediluvian period would have fewer mutations than we have today. They essentially would have had healthier genomes. They would have been front loaded with these incredibly designed DNA repair enzymes. And because it's easier to break a gene and to break a DNA unit than build one up, over time, you'd expect those DNA repair enzymes that go in and fix a lot of these DNA breaks. It's said that we can experience up to 1 million DNA lesions or DNA breaks in a single cell in a single day. Alan, that's incredible because we
It
have
is.
60 trillion cells in our bodies. Thank God we have these amazingly designed DNA repair enzymes to go in and fix a lot of those. Now, they don't do their job perfectly, nor, I believe, do we have as many as we did in the pre-flood world or immediately after creation. And so some get passed on. And we can talk a bit more of that later in terms of what the mutation rate is and so on and so forth. So I believe genetic information would be eroded over time as deleterious mutations accumulate. DNA repair enzymes would be damaged. Pre-flood people would have had longevity genes, which Matt can speak to, that were most likely damaged or eroded in the pre-flood world. It's been said by experts in the field that through technologies like CRISPR, you could go in and fix some of these longevity genes. And what that would result in is the ability to live a little bit longer. We also know over time your end caps of chromosomes, much like the end caps of your shoelace, they erode over time. Your telomeres erode over time, which also limits lifespan. And so that could have been different in the pre-flood world. A big thing that you mentioned that I got to get in here because it's so important, environment. The global, not local, the global Genesis flood would have comprised increased amounts of heat, energy, and radiation due to the catastrophic nature of this worldwide event. And therefore, that increase in radioactivity in the post-flood world, immediately post-flood, would have resulted in decreased lifespans and an increase in mutation-related or even radiation-related disease. You've got these post-flood people groups like Neanderthals, what evolutionists refer to as hominins. And we could discuss all day the hominin fossil record and why it doesn't support human evolution. But a lot of those people groups, they became isolated from your main population at Babel. For example, Neanderthals, Erectus, Hobbit on the island of Flores, a lot of them would have been subject to radiation rocks. And a lot of those people groups also lived in caves where various chemicals would be present that would also affect lifespans. And so there's an answer in a nutshell, I believe, why lifespans have decreased. Matt, anything you want to add, brother?
Yeah, we have to think about the world before the flood, and we can find that there was high levels of oxygen from looking at bubbles that were trapped in amber, and this would have been double atmospheric oxygen levels. So it would be like living in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, toned down a lot, because obviously that's 100%. This is 20% more. So still amazing. You would just be healthy from walking around and breathing. Then we found ancient bacteria. We found this ancient bacteria, and somebody was just crazy enough to inject it into themselves, and every health marker went up. They got healthier from ancient bacteria. That's amazing. Then we also have to realize that man got corrupted. And when they became corrupted, they started doing something very interesting. They started eating meat. And when they started eating meat, what do you do with meat? Well, you cook it. This causes what's known as advanced glycotic end products, or glycation. It's the acronym for age, which is ironic because it literally ages you. And as we know, after the flood, not very many people that went north had many options other than just meat. That's why Neanderthals Neanderthal, Denisovan, all of them that you're finding in the northern hemisphere have a lot of somatic mutations and mutations overall in general because they ate massive amounts of meat that they had to cook, which glycated their bodies and rapidly aged them. So those are two other aspects we can throw in there.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. We're going to move on a little faster now. Question number 3 for you guys is, how many genetic DNA mutations are passed from one generation to the next? We're talking about right now from parent to child.
That's a great question. If we're looking at autosomal nuclear DNA that recombines and that is passed on, for example, I get 50% of my DNA from my mom, I get 50% from my dad. We also have what's called uniparentally inherited DNA compartments, such as the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down on the mother's side. And then you also have the Y chromosome that's paternally inherited. So I got my Y chromosome from my dad, and my sons would have gotten their Y chromosome from me. So in terms of autosomal biparentally inherited nuclear DNA, the mutation rate is high. It's fast. It's roughly 100, some say to 200 new mutations per person per generation. The majority of those nearly neutral, slightly deleterious, invisible to selection. Here's the problem for the evolutionists. Even when it comes to these deleterious mutations, selection might be able to remove your worst deleterious mutations. A single point mutation could kill a person. Therefore, there would be no reproduction, okay? Because it's all about passing on your genes, who can have the most children. And it might be able to amplify the best beneficial mutation. But what's interesting, Alan, even your best so-called beneficial mutations like sickle cell anemia, they're typically reductive. They're typically functionally compromising to organisms. They're due to broken pre-existing systems. Sickle cell anemia, for example, is due to deformed hemoglobin molecules, is due to a broken cell, broken protein. And so even your best so-called beneficial mutations are not driving forward evolutionary change. And so in autosomal nuclear DNA, it's about 100 to 200 per person per generation. In the mitochondrial DNA, it's also fast. That's a smaller chromosome. That's about 16,500 letters. And the mutation rate is somewhere between, it depends what pedigree study you're looking at, somewhere between a 0.1 to 0.5 every other generation. Matt can speak better to that one. The Y chromosome, that is a bigger chromosome. If I remember correctly, there's about 65 million DNA letters in the Y chromosome, and that rate is about 1 to 3 per generation. And here's the last thing I'll say to that, and Matt, feel free to add something. That's incredible, because with fast mutation rates in all DNA compartments, focus on the mitochondrial DNA. You've got overall low diversity worldwide in people groups. In the Y chromosome, you've got overall low diversity. Every single male Y chromosome, you can take it, you can map it out on a family tree, you can compare them, and we're all nearly identical in our Y chromosome, 99% the same. But with a fast mutation rate, 1 to 3 per generation, and then in the mitochondrial DNA, somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5 every other generation, that's biblical time. The question is, how long does it take to accumulate those DNA differences or mutations? Not a long time at all, 45 to 6,000 years roughly. Matt, anything you want to add to there, brother?
No, those are biblical timelines. We love it.
Great. Another quick question for you, Donny. How many generations were there from Adam to you, Donny?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, if if I remember correctly, I think it would be about 200 generations, which means based on the mutation rate, the observed mutation rate, that's biblical time, but roughly 4,500 if we go to the flood bottleneck to 6,000 years.
Very good. How about you, Matt? Do you want to address that?
Yeah. The range would be 160 to 300.
Hmm.
Okay, thank you. My last question is, and this one we could spend hours on, but address the huge number of genetic diseases that mankind suffers today, and why more are being found all the time.
Wow, that's a great question. Dr. John Sanford, I highly recommend. I've probably watched this lecture over a dozen times. He gave a lecture at the NIH, National Institute for Health. This is not a young earth creationist institution. and he gave a presentation on human genetic deterioration. And he talked a lot, especially near the end of it, about this question, the increased amount of diseases. And you can find that uploaded on our channel. It's got 11, 12,000 views. People have really benefited from it. And so a couple things that Dr. John Sanford discusses there and a couple things he doesn't, I can cover here. And so one, the increased genetic load that we discussed earlier has resulted in a huge number of new mutation related diseases, diseases that would have not been present after creation, nor present for the most part in the pre-flood world. We can trace a lot of these diseases back to an original founder and how they spread from there due to new deleterious mutations accumulating. Environmental factors that has resulted in much more disease, the increased amount of radiation after the flood, the massive shifts in environment post flood led to genetic sickness in people groups over time. That's a definite factor. And disease also has a lot to do with our choices as humans. A lot of skeptics, they'll point to what's called the problem of evil, and they'll point out certain diseases and illnesses in this fallen post-flood world. And what they forget is a lot of these diseases, not all of them, but a lot of them have to do with our own choices as humans. What we eat, what we drink, what we put into our water, what we put into the air, how we live, the drugs we take, so on and so forth. I mean, we could discuss that for hours and hours, but there's a couple factors. Matt, anything you want to add, brother?
Man, yeah. Over thousands of years, harmful mutations accumulate, especially the non-lethal forms, such as genetic diseases that affect our quality of life, but not survival or reproduction. And then there's changes in the DNA that happen naturally from copying errors, and then there's somatic mutations, and then there's background radiation, and then there's toxins, fungus, mold, yeast, bacteria, viruses, parasites, heavy metal toxicity, free radical damage, acrylamides, mycotoxins. We can go down the list of things that age us, and in our world that's getting even worse. It's rapidly, exponentially growing. Look at the diseases like autism. It's like 1 out of 40 now or something. There's the rates of all of the diseases are accumulating. And then our technology is getting better and finding even more of them. So that genetic database is exponentially growing with diseases that we're discovering and that are now even more rampant than ever before.
I've heard some say cancer is 1 in 3. These immunological autoimmune diseases are on the rise. And, that's just touching, just in a nutshell, what's going on. But I'd like to say this, Alan, and then hand it back to you because it's such a great question. If we take this point of increased genetic load, gentlemen, back to a point of least accumulating mutations, least genetic load, that would be a point of what? A point of perfection, no disease, no mutations. And that would be what the Bible describes as a very good creation. Adam and Eve created with design diversity, free from mutations and free from disease. And that's why the most important thing to take from this is that our hope is not in this fallen world. Our hope is in heaven, and our hope is in Christ.
Well, thank you for sharing the gospel there at the end, Donny. I appreciate it. Let me close this podcast by reading a Bible verse written by Moses, and it's recorded in Psalms 90, verse 10. And Moses lived about 3,400 plus years ago. And this verse says, as for the days of our life, they contain 70 years, or if due to strength, 80 years. Yet their pride is but labor and sorrow, for soon it is gone and we fly away. So for 3,400 years, people have been living in that 70, 80 range. I'm in that range right now, guys. And yeah, I know there's people who live 90 to 100, but that's not many today. And so basically, yeah, there's lots of things going on in our world that causes all this sickness and disease and things. And we just know the Lord's coming back soon. And praise the Lord. I want to thank you both, Donny Budinsky and Matt Nailor. And may your ministry, Standing for Truth, just flourish and more people listen to you. I joined your podcast recently myself. Thank you so much.
Thank you. God bless. It was a privilege and a real honor, Alan.
Absolutely. Thank you. And if your audience wants to go to Creationist Clothing, they can go over to one of the tabs where you can read articles and click on the first tab for free books look at the book Biblical Longevity, and you can learn all of this stuff that we're talking about today and learn how to fight and combat the disease of aging, cancers, heart disease, and get a different perspective on it from a biblical outlook that does look at genetic entropy. So it's very different than the typical view of the world where evolution will save us from selection, with selection, I mean.
And chemicals are the answer, they say.